Hi everyone. What I want to do in this quick video here is just introduce people to some of the important themes, some of the important works. Particularly we're going to start with sculpture in the art of Florence in the 15th century. So let's begin first by just taking a quick second, just a few minutes I should say, to look at some of the terms that will help us understand what's going on. Some of these are in Italian, can be a little daunting to pronounce, but I'll just walk through them really quickly and see if that helps a little bit. We'll develop the concept of the Renaissance as we go along, but primarily we're talking about a period typically centered in the 15th into the 16th century, manifested especially in Italy, particularly in the area of Tuscany, again Florence, that's interested in ideas of, I don't know, sort of revisiting the cultural legacy of Greece and Rome, particularly in the time of I would say maybe the first century or so of the Roman Empire, the Augustan age, in particular the authors that we'd be familiar with from this period, Cicero, in particular Virgil, Ovid, and so forth, with an idea, with an aim, that is, of seeing what use they might be put in the present age, as well as, of course, perhaps picking up on the excellence, the virtuosity, the sort of technical expertise in Latin that an author, for instance, like Cicero or Virgil would manifest. This plays out, this approach to classical antiquity, moving down to the next phrase right here. This plays out in terms of, again, the study of humanism, classical humanism, and its sort of corollary civic humanism, that is to say, how can we use Roman authors such as Cicero, such as Virgil? It's manifest not just in literature, this interest in classical antiquity, but also in the visual arts, and so we'll see that certainly in an art history class more than anything else. A focus on things that we could describe as secular is pretty important, that is to say, of this world. The notion that individuals can, in a sense, manifest fame, can show that they are well known, particularly for their service to the community, is going to be an important part of that. And the achievement of fame via virtu, a sort of manifestation of the ability to contend, I think is a good way of beginning to think about that. Contend with fate, contend with fortune, and come out ahead regardless. If we look at something like vernacular as a word, it's an important one as we come into the 15th century. It's the use of everyday language to typically describe the events, personalities, goings-on in general of a contemporary time. So, for instance, today we'd be talking about vernacular in at the very least English and possibly more, such as Spanish. Let's see what else here. Important families dominate the political, social, economic scene of Florence. The most famous of these is going to, of course, be the Medici family. If we think about important contributions on the part of the Medici to the history of art, it's almost infinite. They certainly had an effect in transforming Florence away from a republic and into, in essence, a kind of princely court, ultimately culminating in a duchy, a dukedom in later in the 16th century. Some other words, let's keep moving here. Baptistries, a kind of adjunct building to a main church, typically central plan, a circular or perhaps an octagon or similar shape, used to baptize people, particularly infants, for instance. And it's an important structure, certainly, in the history of Florence, as it sits directly to the west of the building. We'll see some important works of art from that. The actual baptistry itself is much older than the church, and there's some interesting architectural contrasts you could have there. The word Duomo in this particular context refers to the seat of the bishop. Okay, sort of like the word cathedral meaning specifically chair, the place where the bishop resides, and that refers, of course, to the primary church in Florence, Santa Maria del Fiore. Let's see some other terms here. Milan and the Visconti family. Milan is a dukedom, so in essence a tyranny, an authoritarian one-man rule kind of a state, and presents a serious threat, particularly in the earlier decades of the 15th century, to the survival of Florence, as Milan attempts to assert its political supremacy throughout the Italian peninsula. And this manifests itself in particular in the baptistry relief competitions of 1402. So the Visconti family is one of the more famous families to run Milan, the other being later in the century, the Sforza family that we remember in our history in large part because of Ludovico Sforza hiring Leonardo da Vinci as a court artist of considerable renown, obviously. The Palazzo della Repubblica, a representative government, as opposed to a dukedom. So we might have an oligarchy, or that is, say, a group of elite families, particularly important, prominent, it's going to be men, running the show for the most part. But nevertheless, it's a form of representative government as opposed to a dukedom. The Palazzo del Signoria, the area of city government, the palazzo, in this particular case, meaning the massive building where the city government meets. And that's an important locus for architecture and especially sculpture, for instance, in the story of David. Here's some artist names really, really quickly here. Lorenzo Ghiberti. GH in Italian is hard G. Ghiberti. Roll the R just a little bit and you'll start sounding a little bit more Italian. You can sort of make the Lorenzo, they give it a little more of a rain sounding if you want to, but it's not necessary really. Important sculptor in the first half of the 15th century, particularly for those famous baptistry reliefs, doors that face the Cathedral, the Duomo. Filippo Brunelleschi, very talented sculptor, but ultimately renowned for his contributions to architecture in the first few decades of the 15th century, culminating in his effort to put a dome on the Duomo to finish off the Cathedral Santa Maria delle Fiori. Nanni di Banco, relatively short-lived, though very, very talented sculptor of the beginning of the 15th century. We'll look a little bit at a sculptural group that he put together for a building known as Or San Michele. Donatello, a profoundly influential figure in Italian art and really European art in general, certainly influential on many, many individuals, including, most prominently for our purposes, Michelangelo Buonarroti, coming along later, born in 1475. Linear perspective as a tool for depicting space, very, very important. Major chapter in the development of visual arts in the West. Contrapposto, representing the human figure, and weight shift is going to be something derived ultimately from the visual vocabulary of classical antiquity. Let's move to the next page and see what else we have. Bottega is a term that means a workshop, and this is very typical for artists to obtain training within workshops, for masters to stamp their identity to some degree on assistants and apprentices in a workshop. We see this most prominently, for instance, in artists such as Andrea del Verrocchio. And Verrocchio is particularly important in the history of 15th century, even going to 16th century Italian art, because among many important artists, Leonardo da Vinci put in quite a bit of time, actually, before his move to Milan in 1481-82. Let's see some other important artists. Antonio da Pollaiuolo, some very interesting innovations, particularly in representing the human figure and the use of mythology, so classical themes in art, such as, and we'll see a sculpture of Hercules and Antaeus. This name, Erasmo da Narni, refers to an important condottiere, that is to say, a mercenary general, along with Bartolomeo Colleoni. Both of these individuals worked for the Venetian Republic, and we remember them in large part due to the efforts of equestrian statues, or the creation of equestrian statues, by the likes of the previously mentioned Donatello and Verrocchio. And we see the Erasmo da Narni, with the nickname Gatta present in a public square in Padua. And Bartolomeo Colleoni pulled off the amazing feat of having a statue commemorating him in a public space in Venice, which is very, very rare. He tried to have it moved to San Marco, but it worked out quite different thanks to the canny sort of machinations of the Venetians. He wound up somewhere else. But nevertheless, a public statue of a figure like that's very rare in Venetian history. The theme of David we'll run into. We see a Donatello David. We'll see, of course, most famously, Michelangelo David, and so forth. I've already mentioned the condottiere, the mercenary general. This is important at the time that we're talking about, with the conflicts, constant conflict between Italian city-states. The last individual mentioned on this term list here is going to be Leon Battista Alberti, particularly important for architecture and his writings on art. And he writes on painting, on sculpture, and on architecture in 3 different books, and is very, very influential in terms of helping us to understand the priorities of 15th century art. Let's just look just really briefly at Florence before we move on to a discussion, perhaps in more specific detail, of art itself. As I said, maybe take a couple minutes to discuss sculpture. As we look at this map of Florence, a plan of Florence, you can see that using the scale that's present right here, that Florence is not very big. And I've walked numerous times from one end of the city to the other, and I can say, for instance, you might get off the train station right here at Santa Maria Novella, directly adjacent to, and to walk across, say, over to Santa Croce is no more, assuming things aren't too crowded and you're a reasonably fit walker, perhaps 20 minutes to half an hour to go from here to here. And the same is true, say, from going from San Marco across the Ponte Vecchio all the way over, say, to the Palazzo Pitti or Santo Spirito right here, famed for its art interior by Brunelleschi, or perhaps over to Santa Maria del Carmine with Masaccio's frescoes. The point being that it's a very compressed urban space, and there's just an extraordinary amount of important architecture, and of course museums such as the Uffizi down here, important buildings, the Florence Cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, the baptistry right there, San Lorenzo, Santa Croce, the Pazzi Chapel within, the Medici Chapel within San Lorenzo. In essence, there's a lifetime worth of architecture, sculpture, and painting, and much else besides within the city. This is more or less the later medieval walls within the walls of Florence. So it's a fascinating place to visit, and one that I've been to many, many times and always look forward to returning to. It's a tightly congested urban center, much like we might say downtown Manhattan, especially in the area of Wall Street, where there's a great deal of activity, particularly in the area of trade, commerce, banking. Manufacturing would be a little bit more on the outskirts, but nevertheless, the idea is that it's a city that's very functional, very busy, and very dedicated to the cause of making money. Very middle-class city, though of course there are going to be aristocratic elements within the city, and that's part of the story, is the tension between commercial middle-class interests and aristocratic interests. Ultimately, as we see with the story of the Medici, the commercial interest transforms itself into an aristocracy of sorts, and we'll see that going forward. We'll pick up the story, and in fact what I think I'll do is pick this up in a separate lecture. We'll pick up the story of the Venetian Renaissance at the very beginning of the 15th century with public sort of competition for the decoration of the east doors of the baptistry of the cathedral. This is a particularly prestigious commission because, of course, the direction, just rewind really quickly here, the baptistry right here, the direction of that baptistry, set of baptistry doors, orients itself such as anyone leaving the cathedral, and lots of people are coming in and going from the cathedral, would face those doors directly. So anybody who wins this competition, and it's a big, big project, is going to have a substantial public reputation, speaking of fame, and a commission that is going to last many, many years, as indeed is the case with Lorenzo Ghiberti. But we'll pick up that story, I think, in another lecture.